Very excited that Ben Moore's here. Ben's a good friend of mine, and he is obviously a screenwriter amongst other things. You might all be familiar with a show.
I'll talk about it.
A small little show. And so he's going to talk about how he made the transition from general writing, I suppose, to writing the screen, and also telling diverse stories. He's been telling his own stories in his own voice, and finding an audience for that. So I hope you make him feel welcome. And also enjoy the session. So if you've got questions, just like the Sally session, feel free to put your hands up and Ben will happily answer them for you.
Absolutely.
So take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Santi. So we've got it. Oh, I haven't done anything yet. Thank you very much. We've got each other for the next hour, and so we can go right up until 12 o'clock, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions because I acknowledge that some of you have a lot of writing and probably performative writing experience already, and some of you don't have any. So I just want to make sure that when we have a big conversation, I'm catering to like all levels of experience. Just to give you some of my background, so I started out as like a magazine writer. I wrote for newspapers. I ended up writing a book. The context in which I wrote my first book was I've always been fascinated by like my family story, and if you are an immigrant to this country, or if you're the child of migrants, and if you belong to one of those groups, you're part of the 1 in 2 Australians that has that family background, and the rest of you are very special as well. But I've always kind of been fascinated by my family story, and as far as I knew, I could kind of trace it back to like the 1970s when my parents got married. My young mum's like about to move to Hong Kong with a guy that, like in retrospect, she barely even knows. And they're just gonna like go to Australia because like my dad visited once and he thought it was really, really nice. And they want a lot of space. Hong Kong doesn't have much space. Australia has a lot of it, despite the bumper stickers. And after this photo was taken, this happened, like very soon after, like the next day. And they did what migrants did so well, which is breed prolifically. And so this is me with my 4 siblings, so I'm one of 5 kids. So we stood out in the coastal suburbs of Queensland for so many reasons. So first of all, it wasn't the clothes, by the way, we actually blended in with those clothes, but we were ethnic in a very white part of Australia. There were a lot of us, so we looked like Pauline Hanson's worst nightmare. And also, shortly after this photo, my parents split up, and that was like a really big thing, not just within the very small Chinese and more broadly Asian Australian community where I grew up, but also just like generationally, the kind of community that we belonged to. We went to a very conservative school. That really made us stand out as well. And then, of course, the other thing that was going on that you might be able to tell by this photo is like, I was starting to understand that I was gay. So all of those things alongside each other led to my first book, The Family Law, supposed to represent me at the age of 12, struggling with identities of race and sexuality, in 1990s Queensland as my parents' marriage combust around me, so it's the classic Australian story. And so yeah, so that book got turned into several different iterations, and then the final version of the book, the current one, has a family on the cover, and it's not my family, it's the TV version of my family, because that book was sold to Matchbox Pictures. They're the production company in Australia that makes everything from Glitch to 7 Types of Ambiguity to The Real Housewives of Melbourne. They make that as well. So I'm like, I like all of your products. They make kids programming like Nowhere Boys and stuff like that. So they're kind of at the forefront. They're probably, in terms of output, they are the biggest kind of production company in Australia at the moment. But they're also run by people who are very much focused on diversity as well. So even if their shows aren't consciously about ethnicity or about sexuality or about being Indigenous, it just incorporates that into the narrative because of the people who are the bosses. So the way that this book that I wrote in particular became a TV show is the book was doing quite well, which is always attractive to TV and filmmakers. If a story has a life previously, they're interested in looking at that, and certainly you see in the Australian film sector especially, but also TV, that a lot a lot of the stories that we tell on screen have had a life somewhere else prior. Tony Ayres is one of the heads of Matchbox Pictures, and he is also Chinese Australian, and he also happens to be gay, so we formed our own little mafia. I didn't have to explain my story too much to him, and he kind of got immediately that my story, as much as it incorporated aspects of ethnicity and sexuality, that wasn't necessarily the engine of the story, or at least all of the time. He got that in the first iteration of the show, we were essentially making a comedy, a black comedy about divorce, which is the funniest thing in the world, obviously. And it was really important to us to have an Asian Australian story on screen that, as much as it was about being Asian Australian, it was about other things as well. Like, I actually love stories that are just about identity, ethnicity and stuff. Like, I want to read that stuff, I want to watch that stuff. It just wasn't necessarily the story we were telling with our show. So we wanted to really make that clear to us and the audience. And it was really great how the audience kind of responded after the first season of the show, which they were like, wow, you know, like, thank you for showing my family on screen. And yes, a lot of the people who had that response were Asian Australian viewers, but a lot of people who had that response were people who come from families where their parents had split up, or they grew up gay in the suburbs, or they just came from a really big, weird family, you know? So I've been spending my entire life identifying with stories that aren't necessarily families or people who look like me. It's really nice to discover that works in reverse as well. And you know, like, it's been said before, but we watch stories where we identify with like anthropomorphic toys and cars and monsters who go to university. Like, why wouldn't we be able to see ourselves in other human beings, you know? So that whole idea that people just want to watch stories where they just look like themselves is simply not true. We shot the show in Brisbane, standing as a Sunshine Coast in Queensland. That was something else that we were really happy about as well, because Queensland stories aren't told very well, and I was pretty stoked that my actual family got involved. So they've made cameo appearances in every season of the show. Part of the project, I know, was just to tell a story that was a story that I hoped would resonate with people on a very personal level, but I would be lying if I said that part of the motivation wasn't political as well. I grew up in the suburbs of coastal Queensland in a largely pre-internet generation, so that kind of dates me. Like, dial-up came in at the end of high school, and as a result, it was really books, magazines, and broadcast television that were my access points to the outside world. So for a really long time, I thought Australia was overwhelmingly white because of the community that I lived in and because of the images that I got. It wasn't until I moved to the city to go to university, I'm like, oh my god, Australia's really multicultural, like no one told me. I felt so betrayed. So that sounds kind of like nuts, especially if you've grown up in a multicultural part of Australia, but I was stunned. And I remember like calling my mum going, like, there are so many Asian people in Australia, like, it's amazing, it's amazing. And for a very, very long time, for those of us who've grown up, you know, non-Anglo in this country, we've probably had a hunch that there aren't that many representations of people who look like us. 2 years ago, Screen Australia actually did the data crunching finally, because that was really important to actually gauge what Australian screens look like versus what our communities look like. And so they particularly looked at scripted dramas and comedies on Australian television. And I don't know if you've seen this graph already, if it came up before, but you know, population-wise, we're 2/3 Anglo-white, but TV drama characters, you've got like well over 4/5 of all characters being Anglo-white. So you see basically everyone who isn't Anglo is underrepresented, and everyone who is Anglo is quite overrepresented in the scripted stuff that we do. It would be interesting to see like whether reality television matches up, because when I watch MasterChef, I'm like, yeah, that's my people, you know what I mean? So scripted TV has a long way to go, but you will notice there is one caveat to all of this, which is that Indigenous Australians represent roughly 3% of the population, but that's actually kind of on parity with how many Indigenous scripted characters we see. That didn't happen by accident. That's the moral of the story. So there was like 1 year in the early 1990s where there were 0 Indigenous characters on screen at all. What changed is television and screen industries actually saw that as a problem, and they invested time, money, resources, and initiatives in making sure that that wouldn't be the case moving forward. So that's why we have Indigenous departments in production companies. We have Indigenous production companies like Blackfella Films. That's why we have Indigenous departments like ABC Indigenous. And you know, slowly the industry is changing itself to the point where, you know, the head of TV at the ABC happens to be an Indigenous woman. And you know, I think we're moving on. We're getting to the point where we see, you know, shows like Clever Man, Miranda Taxel in the lead role in a commercial drama, and it also goes to show through Logies, of course, that people actually want this stuff. This isn't just a politically correct feel-good exercise. So that's just kind of context in terms of like where I came into the industry and why I wanted to get involved. In terms of how I started, and I'm going to talk about skill stuff now, I actually did a bit of a post-grad in screenwriting after I did my undergrad, because at that stage I was already working in magazines, but I thought I wanted to be skilled up for another industry in case it came up. But then I finished that and I was like, I'm living in Brisbane, it doesn't seem to be a real hotspot in terms of like film and TV. But then I wrote my book, The Family Law, and then the screenwrites got sold and they were like, do you have any skills or interest in adapting it? I'm like, I know how to use Final Draft now. So that actually helped, but I would also say that that's not a prerequisite to you actually entering the film and TV industry. I'll talk about like access points later on, and they'll probably come up in questions and answers as well with more specifics. But I just want to give you a bit of advice in terms of what I've learned. So I've probably been screenwriting maybe for the last 5 years professionally. So alongside working on The Family Law, being a creator and co-writer on that show, I've written for a Channel 10 1-hour-long drama called Sisters as well, and that was about a sperm donor who was exposed to have put his sperm samples in the work that he did. Those adult children had now grown and he didn't want them to have incestuous relationships. Anyway, it's a classic Australian story again. And I've also worked as an associate producer and researcher for like feature documentaries and stuff like that as well. And so in all of that, I'm just going to teach you not screenwriting 101, but maybe the biggest kind of lessons and surprises that I got in learning screenwriting professionally over the past 5 years. The first thing that I've realised is it's all about character. When we go down and we start to write, even whether it's a short film or a feature film or a pilot episode, we often so focus on the plot, like, oh my god, what's going to happen, what's going to be like the really best thing, what's going to be the ending that's going to surprise everyone. And yes, you need that, but that stuff won't work unless we have people in the plot that are really interesting, identifiable, three-dimensional as well. Like, it's kind of weird that I'd bring up like movies from the Alien franchise, I know, but like one of my favourite films of all time is Aliens, starring Sigourney Weaver. One of the very, very few performances in a sci-fi film that got an Oscar nomination, by the way. If you guys are familiar with Aliens, you would have felt like really emotionally invested in Ellen Ripley's journey, especially with saving Newt. And that's because I think Ellen Ripley was this incredibly well-developed character. Like, she had a moral centre, she was complicated, she was faced with ethical choices, and because we got this background in that she was a mother who lost her child, when she discovers this new child to rescue, the stakes become really high. So ostensibly, yes, it's a war film with aliens in it, and the plot is amazing, the special effects are great, but we don't care, or we don't get invested unless we care about the characters. And it's been really interesting to see this franchise evolve and maybe arguably devolve, because like a film like Alien Covenant comes out and I'm like, that was kind of exciting, but I don't really remember what happened in it anymore. And that's because I don't actually remember any of the characters. I mean, you could argue that some of the characters were kind of interesting, but I don't really remember any of them. And, you know, as time has gone on, that franchise has become, you know, less and less kind of successful, both critically and commercially, because I think there's no central character like Ellen Ripley for us to really rally for. So the main things with character is you've got to make characters three-dimensional and complicated. When you're writing someone heroic, like no one's heroic all of the time, you know, like you've got to give them flaws so that we actually identify with them. And this isn't just like a challenge or a conflict that will come up in the road like an obstacle, because that's plot. What are the internal things that they wrestle with? What are the things in their backstory
that really challenge them. Also, when you're writing bad people as well, like, I hate watching what is supposed to be an adult drama, whether it's real adult drama or sci-fi or anything else, and the villains are essentially cartoons. Like, I want to know how the villain became that way. That isn't excusing their behaviour for wanting to blow up the world or whatever, but I want to kind of know what makes them human and identifiable so that we can actually relate to the situation that's going on. I'm bringing up a lot of blockbusters as examples, like as extreme examples of what I'm talking about, because often when we talk about like either Aliens or Game of Thrones or whatever, we're so focused on a plot, and then this happens, and then dragons happen, and White Walkers happen, blah, blah, blah. But when you think about Game of Thrones, who watches that? Yeah. So if you're familiar with Game of Thrones, like, this is like an epic kind of thing, and why I particularly like this show, probably more than something like Lord of the Rings even, is because this is an example where the heroes do reprehensible things. Daenerys has done some stuff that I don't agree with, and the villains, you don't agree with what they do, but you kind of get where their headspace is at. Cersei Lannister is the villain of the show on paper, I guess, but she's lost so much, and she grew up in a really deeply patriarchal environment that completely oppressed her and limited her choices. So when she's got her hand behind her back, she's going to act in these certain ways, as we might as well if we were in her situation. There has to be kind of like nuance to what you're doing. I think the only character who probably like falls short of what I'm talking about is Jon Snow. He's a little bit too perfect, and I think he's the most boring character of the show because he's just very good. But they've kind of made fun of that as the show has progressed. Like, similarly, Tyrion Lannister, like, he's one of the most interesting heroes of this show, but he is like, he's kind of like stumbling through this world as an addict, stumbling through this world with a chip on his shoulder, but as someone with a visible disability who's been treated in these certain ways, you kind of understand where that comes from as well. So make your characters sing, make them, make us understand how they behave and why they're behaving that way, even if we don't agree with it. Okay, once you've got your characters, one of the things that I've really learnt about in writing the family law is that characters should be so developed, so vivid, that when you put this character and this character in a room and in a situation, it's almost inevitable how they're going to react to each other and the situation, because they're like chemicals, You put that chemical and that chemical, something is just going to happen. And that's really where a lot of plot comes from, especially when you're writing television. Where you can really develop storylines as time goes on. This is kind of like the classic thing, but I think it's a formula that it's worth keeping in mind, because if you are writing a drama, and that includes comedy as well, like if you were writing something with a narrative goal in mind, you need to have some sort of central conflict. That can be as external as Game of Thrones or Alien, or it can be as internal as, a quiet Scandinavian family drama. It can. Those things apply to both of those realms. Well, how do we get conflict? How do we get drama? It's like complicated, nuanced characters who want something. Well, they need something. That might be love, or it might be a goblet with magical powers, like either or, whatever it is, they want something. And then there are obstacles in the way. And those obstacles can be other characters, and yes, those obstacles can be an avalanche or an alien queen or a fire-breathing dragon or whatever, but obstacles will get in their way, and those obstacles will reveal who that person is, and then we've got like delicious conflict and drama. I know that this sounds really remedial, but this is a map that often helps. Like when we're doing even the family law, which is a TV comedy, we're not talking about dragons, we're not talking about war, we're not talking about, super high-stakes stuff necessarily, but we actually draw on the whiteboard characters alongside each other on a graph and what each of them wants, and then we kind of map out where the conflicts happen, and that's actually how we plot a lot of, we have initial hunches about what that episode is about, we know thematically what it's about, and then we have a start point. What does each character want? What do they need? And how are they going to interfere with each other? And that's kind of it. And when you watch even your favourite half-hour comedies on television, you'll see that as well. You'll start seeing television like a writer. You know, conflicts, as I said, can be both internal and external. So, you really, really want to find true love, but your very traditional family wants you to stay at home and study and get married and have sex after that, and you're like, well, I really, really like this hot guy, or whatever. It can be that, and then there are external things that will get in the way of you meeting up with that hot guy at night. Like your little sister will run in the room and it's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? That's an obstacle that can get in the way, and of course your family's expectations of you. Conflicts are, like I said, with opposite goals and agendas to yours, and those goals and agendas, even though they might be opposite to the protagonist, like it's often interesting when they're kind of understandable or noble, intentions or agendas, and that can really make things morally murky and interesting for what you're writing. And you've got to really kind of nail what the complications in the conflict are, because if it's just all external conflict and it's not internal conflict, if it's just external obstacles, it's just basically Australian Ninja Warrior, which is a very, very good show, I know, but it's an obstacle course. An obstacle course is good for a video game, but it's not good for story. And what we're trying to do is tell human stories. One big surprise that I really found in writing The Family Law is that I went into the room thinking, we gotta write a comedy. So what's funny? And we all kind of tried becoming these joke machines, and it's like, and then the mum will say something outrageous, and she'll get all her words right, and everyone will laugh, and that's a great show. We've got Logies, yes. And we very, very quickly realised not how you write a comedy, or at least the comedy that we wanted to write. I think for us, we really had moved beyond the idea of a sitcom with an 80s laugh track where we've got conflict, punchline. And that's kind of, what we really wanted to make for our show was a comedy that really mined real pain and delivered the laughs out of it. And to honour kind of the hurt that the story was trying to tell, real parental separation is about hurt, and we didn't want to ignore that. And what we decided very, very quickly was that we'd write the whole show as a drama. We don't write it as a comedy, and yes, there are some really good jokes in the show, thank you very much. But those jokes would just come naturally to us because we either came from comedy writing backgrounds, or Lawrence Lone, who is a comedian, co-wrote one of our episodes. We've just got funny people in the room. One of our executive producers is Debbie Lee, who is one of the people at the ABC who executive produced and commissioned Please Like Me for the ABC. She used to be in heavy comedy. So we already had comedic instincts in the room. And sometimes the writer's room, and this is something I can talk about later if you like, it would be us gathered in a room. It would be our producer and showrunner, Sophie Miller, my co-writer, Kirsty Fisher, me in the room, a note taker, sometimes another producer, sometimes Debbie Lee would be in the room, and we'd just talk about situations in our life that kind of reminded us of what we were trying to write, how we felt, how awful it was, how strange it was that that person would say that to you, and it's like, well, actually, I was that person in that situation, and this is how I felt. So as much as we were talking about, stories inspired by my family, we were kind of all sharing very intimate stories of ourselves. And if you ever find yourself collaborating with other people in the writing process, and this is what television essentially is, you'll often find that as much as you're doing a lot of writing, it's a lot of just story sharing. It becomes a really great therapy session. And then you kind of feed that into your characters. Because for instance, I'm writing a show that's an ensemble show, but the main two characters are a son and a mother. And as much as I can access my mum's perspective because it's inspired kind of by my real mum, I'm not a mum. I'm not a parent. That doesn't preclude me from writing her lines and everything, but it really helps in the room the fact that we have three parents, and they tell me, when you've got a kid of school age like Benjamin, this show is, and this happens to your child, you would react like this because nothing is going to, get in the way of you, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, that is so great. I would have not appreciated that or understood that as intimately as you described it. Let's put what you just said into the character, but into her own voice. So you've got to really just honour the real drama, and then laughs can come later. But if you just, if you're writing like slapstick comedy, if you're writing sketch comedy, that's something obviously very, very different to what I'm talking about. What we wrote was something that's more based on this. Our reference points were things like, HBO's Girls, Issa Rae's HBO comedy Insecure. We were talking about Police Like Me, obviously. These are all shows where you really do see drama first and foremost. Aziz Ansari's show, Master of None, we were talking about that as a reference point. Like that whole episode about immigrant parents. Like there are laughs in that, but it's really like kind of heartbreaking as well. That's what we were trying to do. Another thing that I wasn't prepared for going into the family law, so these are just surprises, so like stuff I wish I knew during the screenwriting process, is how much revision is involved in writing. Like most of your writing will be revision. Your first draft is one of many, I'll show you. So for the first episode of The Family Law ever, so series 1, episode 1, this is how many revisions we did. And those are revisions, like full revisions. These aren't tweaks. This is like we tore apart the script and kind of started again. And so that went from, we can see the date. It started on December 2012 and it ended in March 2015 with that many revisions. And when you look at the initial script, yes, some lines of dialogue and even maybe some scenes are still there, but there were just so many things that weren't necessarily wrong with it, but were like, we can do better than that. And the more that you start writing your episode, the more that you start realising actually we're trying to actually say something with this script. This sounds really old-fashioned, but that there is something that we're trying to convey. Not like a message, not like, and that's why we don't drink after, like we're not trying to do like an after-school special, but we're trying to say something like, an argument between parents can lead to an argument that's about everything else about their marriage, and then this happens. Like we want to convey that in the script because, maybe in the first iteration of the script we had something like, and then they fight, she kicks him out, the door slammed, and we would just spend every other revision interrogating that. It's like, are we on her side or on his side? No, I just think like what she says in that moment is far too cruel. Do we pull it back because we want the audience to understand that both had a part to play in that argument? And when we knew we got it right was when our executive producers and when the broadcasters started having fights saying, no, he's right, no, she's right. And we're like, great, that's ready. So yeah, revision is fundamental in all of this. It's an exhausting process, but a very healthy one. I'm just going to finish off by just giving you writing advice, predominantly from the best original screenplay writers who were nominated for Oscars in the last round, because I think those in particular were some really great films, and I've just thrown in some extras as well. So Kumail Nanjiani and Emily Gordon, who are real life husband and wife, they wrote The Big Sick, and Kumail stars as himself, and then an actor, Zoe Kazan, plays Emily Gordon, and they wrote this story that was essentially about their love story, and it starts off as a cross-cultural kind of story. It's like, immigrant background dude, Pakistani dude falls in love with a white girl, blah, 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 blah. That's already interesting and complicated enough, but then she has a medical episode where she falls into a coma, and those families have to deal with each other in a very, very different way, and it's based on a true story. And Emily Gordon and Kumail Nanjiani were saying in this interview, it's really great to write what you know, but to also have a little bit of breathing space between when it happened to you and when you're going to write about it. So you actually know what you're trying to say with that story. Sometimes when we go through something dramatic, like I've taught classes before where people submit stuff and I'm like, so this feels like revenge. Which can be legitimate, but if revenge can feel really, really personal, and if it feels really, really personal, an audience might not be able to access what you're trying to say beyond this person sucks, And again, that kind of motivation also prevents you often from writing a three-dimensional character because you haven't had time to think about other perspectives in the room. So for me, when I was writing The Family Law, the book, and when I was writing the screenplay, people were like, wow, that's so personal. How can you write about that stuff? It's so so like bruising, aren't you traumatized? I'm like, no, it happened like 15 years ago. Like I had plenty of time to process it to the point where I could talk about it as comedy. I could talk about that horrible custody weekend where my dad took us out to like a wildlife park and we were attacked by emus. Like, you know, it became funny, it was horrible at the time, but it became funny later on. So Emily Gordon said, for this film, it had been 5 years since the events of the film actually took place, so it helped because she was far enough away that she could look at it and still feel it, but not so close to it that it was completely overwhelming to her. She says if you see someone create a piece of art and they're still in the throes of going through something, it may feel too vulnerable for the audience to actually process it, which can be beautiful, but we didn't want this to feel like an overly intense kind of movie, which you can feel in danger of when you're watching something like that. So that's just something to keep in mind, like your intention with what you're writing and when you want to go about writing it. Have you guys seen Jordan Peele's Get Out? Because like, if you haven't, it's just one of the best films of the decade, of this century. It's one of the most original and terrifying and funny films. So I really wanted to see what he said about writing Get Out. And one of the things he said was quite interesting, which was making your protagonist relatable. This isn't the same as making your protagonist likable, by the way. It's about whether we can identify with the protagonist, because Get Out was such a specifically, black experience film. But even if we're not black, we can all identify with the sensation of being the only ... in the room, and everyone is saying shit that really is offensive to us, being the only ... person in the room. So Jordan Peele says, I was worried at several stages during the writing that this would be a horribly divisive project where I'd lose even black people because we're victims, and that's hard to watch. And I also worried that maybe I'd lose white people because white people are the villains, and then that would be an assault on them. One of the most fulfilling things to see was how an audience would go in with their preconceived notions, and by the middle, they were all Chris, they were all the main character. By making that experience, and therefore the character relatable, we all kind of inhabit that story, and we can all kind of empathise with, therefore, the broader politics of what that story is trying to tell us. Aaron Sorkin, sometimes I think he's the greatest screenwriter, sometimes I think he's the worst. But when he wrote The Social Network, one of the things that he said at the time was, getting stuck in the middle of a script is part of the job, and don't worry about it. Like failure, I can't actually feel like failure is just all writing. Like all of us just fail with every sentence and every bit of dialogue until you write like you saw my revision process. Like that was just a lot of failure before we got a script that could be shot and produced. So, if one of the most revered screenwriters of Hollywood is saying that getting stuck is part of the job, just kind of remember that like everyone is feeling it at the same time. He says, people ask if I have writer's block, and that's my default position. And so most days I go to bed not having done anything except climb the walls because I don't have an idea or I'm stuck for where I am. And you really do think in those moments that you're never going to write again. And those are tough moments. And the reason I bring that up is just like, that's normal. It sucks. I have to say, like most days I find writing really, really difficult. And sometimes one of the things I struggle with is, and you know that your characters aren't working or aren't developed enough when you can cover their names and they start looking the same. Have you guys done that with your work? And you're like, yeah, I haven't really quite nailed how they talk or what's going on in their interior world. Like I'm writing a play at the moment and I'm kind of struggling with that. But as time goes on, and you start really knowing your characters, I know it sounds like really mystical, but part of the revision process is really getting acquainted with these people that you're putting on the page, getting to know them better, what their motivations are. And also, one of the things I find really handy with me when I'm writing is actually being explicit, like doing whiteboard post-it note kind of stuff. That this character wants this. This character has a saviour complex. His sister has a martyr complex. And their mum has a victim complex. Like those things are really, like just those nuances are really, really important to nail down. This person has been living in California for the last 5 years, so they're going to kind of talk Valley Girl-ish, you know. So just remember those kind of fundamentals that play off each other. This person has a tertiary education, so they'll probably use words like, you know, paradigm. Yeah, those things are really good. One of the things that the screenwriter Anthony McCartan, who wrote The Darkest Hour, said is like, know your ending from the start, and this has been like one of the most handy things for me lately when I've been writing television or writing the play. So the play that I'm working on, you know, it's a 20,000 word thing, and I was really, really stuck with like scene 5. And I just don't think, like if I had to write this scene one more time, I'm like going to walk into the sea or something. It was just so awful. And then I remembered, like, no one's asking me to write scene 5 right now. No one's like, and so I'm like, I think I just need to know how this play ends. And it'll be satisfying for me because then I can write the end. You know, I can trick my mind into it. And it was really a really good challenge for me to understand what I was trying to say, where these characters needed to end up, and how I wanted to leave the audience feeling. And so I just spent the entire day, I ignored scene 5 and went straight to the final act. I just wrote it all out. And sometimes I even wrote it out in bullet points. I want the audience feeling this. This needs to happen, this needs to happen, and this needs to happen. It's like Vince Gilligan when he wrote Breaking Bad, if any of you've seen Breaking Bad. So that final season of Breaking Bad is insane, right? I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but it's also perfect. Like everything works together like clockwork, and it foreshadows in the very first episode of the final season Walter White putting the gun in the back of his car. They didn't know where that was going. They just decided to write that scene as a flash forward and then start the show. What they essentially did was they wrote the ending first. And they wrote that, they were like, okay, let's keep writing. Let's get back to the gun now. And so like throughout that entire season, they just kept going back to the gun, what that meant, what that meant, what that meant. They knew where the final episode was. You know, this is the difference between a really great show, knowing how to wrap up, versus, you know, a show like Dexter, which all accounts has one of the worst finales of all time. But Breaking Bad knew exactly where it was going. And that really makes for a satisfying story. So if you're ever stuck, I just shoot ahead. You know, you're allowed to flash forward. You're the writer. And I really love this piece of advice by Greta Gerwig, who wrote Lady Bird. Lady Bird, like for those of you who've seen Lady Bird, like it was one of those films where I'm like, this is going to be kind of predictable, and I think I've seen this before. A young white woman's coming of age. So great. It's so great. The dialogue is so original. I really, really like it. And Greta Gerwig is like quite omnivorous with kind of like all of her references in what she's trying to write. And she says, you know, this sounds really negative, I don't mean it to be negative, but I would say to figure out what you hate. Actually figure out what you hate, figure out what you in a movie theatre would think, if I see another scene like this, I'm going to rip my hair out. Or if I see another character do this thing, I will rip my hair out, because I do think it kind of gives you an energy, an anger, and an ability to figure out what you want to do with your own writing. So, you know, recently, I was very highbrow, and I saw a lot of films at the Scandinavian Film Festival, and I went with my boyfriend and his mum, and we just came out of a film having hated it. But it was such a beautiful film, like visually beautiful. It had all the stuff I like in a film, which is like quiet, intense, emotional drama, a lot of the drama coming from things that are unsaid, weird kind of, moral grey areas between parents and children. And I'm like, so why did I hate it? And so I spent like the next hour just talking at them and with them about why we thought it was really, really bad. And we just realised that some of the conflict didn't ring true, some of it wasn't even conflict, things didn't happen as cause and effect, like one of the main characters dies or disappears, and then the next scene is them going, oh, he's not here anymore. And it's like, well, but you're in the third act, that's when things climax and crescendo, but there are no consequences for someone having disappeared off your show. And we weren't actually sure what the film was trying to say, if anything. And so, you know, coming to that, me 10 years ago, I would have just walked out of that film saying, I want to wipe that film from my memory and not have to think about it again. But what I really encourage you to do instead is to really like analyze and go through an autopsy of stuff that you really, really love, what you love about it, and conversely also what you hate. And I'll just leave you with a final takeaway. If you're ever stuck with not just screenwriting, but any writing, just give us action, what happens next, especially when you've got great characters, what happens next, and then give us a reflection, like work out what this means. What does this journey mean for these characters? What are you trying to say? I'm not saying that there needs to be a moral to the story, but there needs to be, I don't know, like a takeaway where people are like, I identify with that complicated thing you've just presented. Maybe it's just like, you know, families are tough and sometimes situations are unreconcilable for all the best intentions or something like that. Think about the themes and messages that you want to convey and take it from there. Because, you know, when you think about it, for those of you who come from a religious background, whether it's an imam or a pastor or a rabbi, this is actually how we receive stories. You know, this happened and the prophet said this, and then this happened and this is the meaning. This is very core storytelling. This is how we all receive story. Without the reflection or without the interpretation, it's just kind of often sometimes a Wikipedia entry of stuff. It's not a story. That's where I'll leave you, but yeah, any questions, and I totally get that some of you will have industry questions, some of you will have craft questions, no question too big or small.
Any questions? We've got 2 minutes for Ben before we go for the break.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Yes?
So you were attached to the screenwriting, was it? Or, sorry, maybe I'm getting stuff over
Yeah.
Story development.
Story development. Sorry.
Yeah, you're right. No. I barely know the Frankie. I'm in a room with people now. We're doing things. Yeah.
So, for you, like, what do you think that, like, what did you walk into that opportunity with so that you could, like, you got as much as you did out of it?
Do you mean like before I started working on the family
so
law?
did you kind of have like an intention that what I need to get so I can, you know, obviously.
Well, when I did my postgrad, it was basically a course. So it was just like, I just want to get the skills. I want to learn how to use the software. I want to learn how a writer's room works. I was lucky in that, you know, in that course to, you know, be working under people who'd worked in the screen industry in Australia for a really long time. I want to know the language. Like, you know, I felt like I could tell stories through my journalism and through essay writing, but it was all about format and structure and discipline, you know. So it was about all of that technical sort of stuff. But even though I knew all of that from coursework, it was still a really different thing walking into a professional writing room. And one of the biggest lessons that I had to learn from that is also feeling confident enough to present idea after idea after idea and getting like 90% of them shut down. And also you being able to shut down other people's ideas. That takes like such chutzpah and confidence. And I'm really arrogant about it now. Well, that doesn't work out. How about, but you also have to offer alternatives. Like if we took that and we did this, could that work? It's almost like improing. It's almost like a dinner party conversation that you really need to be invested in. You can't be shy at the writer's room, unless you're a note taker, in which case, just please you know, because sometimes, you know, note takers can be like, and this is a really good idea, and that's great, but like sometimes note taking, we should just be really good observing and just like being a spy instead. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Good. Yes.
This kind of relates to what you're saying, but for me personally, I really struggle with feedback if there's a lot of different voices coming at me.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, how do you, I think it's a personal thing, but how do you...
No, I think everyone struggles with feedback. Yeah, it's
how
really
do you
hard.
deal with what you kind of, take in
Yep.
and then what you reject?
Totally. Well, first I had a bit of a cry.
Yeah.
But no, I just, like, you have to brace yourself because, you know, like, to write is to be vulnerable. Like, you're really stripped of all your armour and then someone's seeing your guts and they're poking around and it's like, well, that's gross. And then they send it back to you and it's like, ta-da! And I find it really tough because, you know, especially at the crunchy end of screenwriting, when we're actually going into production, the notes come hard and fast and they become less cushioned with compliments as well. It's like, this is wrong, this needs to happen. And then you become dead inside and that really rocks actually. Like in those early stages when it's like, this is the story and then the feedback comes. And like you say, if there are different stakeholders in the story, so like with a TV show like The Family Law, we work, me and my co-writer, we've got our producer, and our producer's giving us notes. We have two producers who are giving us notes. Then we have an executive producer, and we sometimes have two executive producers. Then we've got the network, SBS, and then we've got the production company that's owned by an American company. All these people give us notes. And sometimes it's up to the people here to sort out the notes, and it's like, we agree with that, and then it gets filtered down to us. But sometimes you kind of get a little bit of everything, and then it becomes a discussion. And this is what it boils down to, the discussion. And I remember when I was first writing The Family Law, I was kind of getting overwhelmed and intimidated by the feedback, not just the volume of it, but it coming from all angles, and not sure what I believe the show to be. My friend Deborah Oswald, she made Offspring, and so she's been working in this for ages. And she was like, oh, it's the traffic light system, red, yellow, green. Like, there are some things where you're like, thank God you gave me that feedback. I'm so embarrassed and grateful. You know, yes. Yellow is like when you're unsure, and it's like, I think you're right, but I'm not sure. So you just kind of flag it, because that's another conversation. And then you've got to identify the reds, where it's like, you don't get it, and I will die on this hill, and you need to be able to stake your claim. But why that process is difficult is because it requires clarity of what your story is. And that's a process, it's not a moment, and that warrants conversation and communication. So, and it also, for us, as writers, takes a while for us to know what we're writing. I know that sounds really weird, but like, when you get feedback, it shakes your confidence, and you're like, oh, is that what I'm trying to write? So you need some kind of, some space sometimes. Yeah. Does that help? Yeah.
Traffic lights. Yeah.
Traffic lights. Yeah. Yes.
So being the creator of the show, when the writers' room was put together, did you have a say or suggestions into who you wanted to be a part of the writers' room?
Yes and no. Like, I don't call the shots. So the creator credit is kind of like accurate. Like, it's just kind of saying you conceived of the show. It doesn't mean that you're the boss.
Yeah.
So producers, executive producers, they really run the show. Like, that's why when something wins Best Film, the producer is receiving the award, not the screenwriter or the director or anyone else, because they're the boss. But it's a collaborative, well, hopefully collaborative process. And because my story is quite personal, they're always like, what do you think about this writer coming in? What do you think about this writer coming in? So there was that level of consultation there, but I don't make that ultimate decision. Yeah.
Writing such a personal story and then having that come to screen, I guess, how did you find, I guess, balance between the reality and what we see, what's portrayed, and what's embellished, and what's not?
We decided very, very early on that this was a story inspired by stuff. There's heaps of fiction. We moved it to present day, almost to signal to the audience, yeah, it's based on a memoir, but like Ben couldn't have been that young. Then like you've got to kind of give that up. And we also decided that, you know, because the book on which it's based is kind of structurally a mess. It's just an anthology of short stories, short essays. And so we needed to create a superstructure for the show. And so for the first season, it was one very hot summer, starting from the graduation, right up until, you know, nearly the start of school again, where everything goes wrong, and the whole question is, will they get together or won't they get back together? And that's an artificial kind of thing that we attach, that we hang the story off. And therefore you need to completely be promiscuous with the truth in order to get what we always refer to as the emotional truth. We're trying to get to an emotional truth of what this would feel like for a child and what this would feel like for a parent. And that's always the line we came to. You know, weirdly, you know, a lot of the stuff that comes up in the show, some of the stuff that I think is most impactful did actually happen in real life. You know, the scene where the mum kicks out the dad, that's very, very close to how it happened in real life. And then there's a scene coming up at the end of season 3, which hasn't gone to air yet, which is like, it's basically word for word for what happened. But then like everything around it is completely made up. But we just want to make sure that that final thing, or that first thing that can be honoured, that where we want the moment to really resonate, needs to be supported by a lot of other good story and so that's fictional. Yeah.
So, when you first started writing it was obviously like a solo writing project. How does that sort of, what's that relationship been to you being like the only writer to sort of moving to being like within a team of writers?
So weird. It was really, really weird because like I've always worked solo, whether it's like journalism, essay writing, books, like it's just me in a room. And like like when I first went into a writer's room, I felt like I was a coming of age story about finding my voice. I'm like, what about if, no, don't worry. Like, I'm shy because like so much of the thought process is in our own head. And like I hate telephones because I think I'm just like a writer, like I just want to do text communication. And so it was really, really challenging for me to say, like it really had to become in my mind, I'm like, you know what, it's like a dinner party. You can do dinner parties well, you can do conversation there, that's what you need to do. Otherwise you're going to be excluded from this room, none of your ideas are going to fly. One thing that I am used to as a freelance writer is getting a lot of rejection for my pitches. I'm just like, oh yeah, whatever, like they didn't like that idea, they didn't like that idea. I've got to get used to that with the ideas in the room, because if I said, what if the child said this, and they'll be like, oh, and I'm like, oh okay, no, don't worry about it. You know, like I just have to go, oh yeah, no, well what about this, what about this? And it was when Marie Cardy worked on the first season of The Family Law, she came in and she's just like, ideas, which is like, rah! And I'm like, oh my god, that's how you do it. And so it took seeing an example like her to be like, okay, I kind of get it now. But yeah, it was a tough transition, not gonna lie. Yeah. Should we get one more question? Yes, how are you?
I just want to ask about the process of sort of selling the rights to Matchbox. What about the international distribution that you guys have?
Yeah, so when The Family Law was a book and it was going into its second print, my publishers were part of like, I think it was at like Melbourne Writers Festival or Melbourne International Film Festival. There's like a session where publishers actually start pitching their books to producers. So, you know, my book was being picked out. Yeah, it was at MIF. And my book was kind of like happily being picked out. And yeah, and there were different production companies that we started having conversations with. And it was my publisher and I having active conversations about what we felt was the best home for it. And then when Matchbox got on board, well, you know, it was Tony Ayres that really just, you know, I just worshipped him already. So that was enough to convince me. And then from there, what was your other question about international distribution?
What was that sort of one of the factors that you guys have in mind, like once this series get made, whether?
Obviously it really helps, like if you can do a co-production and then you can get that international distribution as part of the deal, like if we were making it Netflix or whatever, but we were just making it, you know, us within Matchbox, NBCU, and then NBC Universal, the parent company, then sells it to the overseas territories where it's been at, so like Comedy Central Asia, it's been through in a few European territories and African ones, but yeah, and then once we do the third series, we might just package it and like sell it as a whole to, I don't know, this is really like technical and boring now in a way, but like yeah,